Iron Ridge, New Mexico Territory. Summer, 1882. Red dust. Cracking heat. A woman tied to a wooden post in the middle of the town square, wrists bound, back bare, blood running slow. 60 people stood watching. Not one of them moved. The whip came down a third time. She broke. Her voice tore open across that silent square. Somebody help me. Nothing. Then boots on hardpack. A stranger stepped out of the shadows, lean, dark coat. 2 Colts on his hips he hadn't touched yet. Thorne smiled. You are interfering with the legal administration of Iron Ridge law. The stranger looked at him. Both hammers clicked back. His voice came out low and flat. Your law is filthier than a hog wallow, mister. And I don't follow a coward's law. A woman who refused to lose everything. An outlaw wanted in 4 territories. And a corrupt empire about to find out what happens when the wrong 2 people find each other. This one's going to stay with you. Let's go. The sun had no mercy in Iron Ridge. It pressed down on the town like a flat iron on wet cloth, drawing the moisture right out of the earth, out of the wood, out of a person's will to resist. The dust in the square was red today. Fine and red, like rust ground to powder, curling up in slow spirals each time the wind moved through, and the wind moved through often, carrying nothing with it but heat and the smell of horse dung and old leather. Loretta Sterling had been dragged from the county seat building at 9:15 in the morning. She hadn't fought them. Not because she was weak. She'd stopped fighting when the second man twisted her arm behind her back far enough that the joint sang with white-hot pain, and she'd realized that fighting would only make it worse. So she walked. Head up, jaw set, boots raising little clouds of red dust with every step they forced her through. There were maybe 60 people in that square. 60 people who watched from the shade of boardwalks and doorways, standing behind their water troughs and hay wagons, pressed up against the barber shop window, peering out through parted curtains. 60 people who had known Loretta for years, had eaten her husband Elias's corn at harvest season, had let their children pick apples from Oakhaven's East Grove. Not one of them moved. Barnaby Thorne stood in the center of the square, like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, which, in Iron Ridge, he more or less did. He was dressed in a black frock coat, a silver watch chain catching the sun across his belly. His hat was the expensive kind, Eastern-made, with a dark band that had never seen a speck of trail dust. He held a folded paper in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other. He looked comfortable. That was the most disturbing thing about him. He looked like a man settling into a chair at the end of a long day, not a man about to order a widow flogged in the town square. Loretta Ann Sterling, his voice carried without effort. He'd spent years practicing that voice on courtrooms and backroom dealings. You stand here today, in breach of a legal loan agreement, dated the 4th of March, 1882. The sum owed to Iron Ridge Savings and Trust is $463. You have failed to pay. You have failed to vacate. And you have, in my professional opinion, failed to demonstrate even the most basic understanding of the obligations your late husband entered into. He sipped his lemonade, as provided for under the terms of said agreement, and in accordance with the authority vested in this establishment by the territory of New Mexico. You will receive 10 lashes as a lawful penalty and a warning to the citizens of this county. He folded the paper neatly. Grizzly Knox came forward. He was a large man, built in a way that looked like 2 men compressed into one, wide through the shoulders, thick through the neck, with hands that seemed too big even for his body. He wore no shirt under his vest on days like this. Some men said it was because of the heat. Others said it was because Knox liked for people to see the muscle, to count the scars, to understand exactly what kind of work he had done in his life. He was holding a whip. It was a single-tail bullwhip, maybe 8 feet of braided brown leather, with a cracker on the end that Knox kept freshly trimmed. He let it uncoil in the dirt as he walked, easy and unhurried, like a man enjoying a Sunday stroll, Two of Thorne's hired men tied Loretta's wrists to the hitching post with rough cord. They weren't gentle about it. The wood was sun-dried and splintered, and it bit into her forearms where they pressed her against it. One of the men worked at the back of her collar, pulling it down, and she jerked her head away. "Don't," she said. It was the first thing she'd said all morning. Her voice was steady. The man ignored her. The square was very quiet. 60 people. And the only sound was the wind moving through and the slow, lazy flapping of a signboard down the street. Loretta could feel every eye on her back. She pressed her forehead against the post and stared at the grain of the wood. She focused on that, the little dark lines in the pale wood, the way they curved and split. The first lash came without warning. It cracked like a rifle shot. The sound hit the walls of the buildings around the square and came back at her from every direction. She didn't scream. The pain was extraordinary, a bright, total agony that climbed up her spine and exploded at the base of her skull, but she ground her teeth together and held it in. The second came before the sound of the first had fully faded. She made a sound then. She couldn't help it. A sharp, choked sound that she felt ashamed of, even as it came out of her. She looked out at the crowd. Through watering eyes, she looked. A woman she recognized, the wife of the liveryman, had turned her face away. An old man near the feed store had taken off his hat and was staring at the ground. A preacher standing near the church steps had his eyes closed and his lips moving. Praying, maybe, asking God to do something about the situation, since none of the 60 people in that square intended to do it themselves. The third lash landed, and Loretta Sterling did something she had promised herself she would never do. Not just in pain, in desperation. In the sudden, raw, animal understanding that she was alone, that she was going to take all 10, and no one was going to stop it, that the world had decided she did not matter enough to defend. "Please," her voice broke, wide open. It rang across that red dust square and hit every silent face. "Somebody help me." The words hung in the air. Nothing moved. And then something did. He came out from the shadow of the feed store, awning the way smoke comes through a crack in a wall. Quiet. Unhurried. Moving with a particular stillness that some men carry, the kind that only comes from having been very close to death on a regular basis, and making a kind of peace with it. He wore a dark trail coat despite the heat, a black hat pulled low, and 2 Colt revolvers on his hips that he hadn't drawn yet. He was not a large man, not the way Knox was large. He was lean and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than bone, and eyes the color of creek water in winter. He walked across the square at an even pace, hands loose at his sides. Nobody spoke. Knox turned at the sound of the boots on the hardpack, saw the stranger, and shifted his grip on the whip. He raised it. The draw was faster than thought. The Colt came out of the holster in a movement so clean and so fast that most people in that square would argue afterward about whether they'd actually seen it happen or just heard the result. The gun cracked once, a single flat report, and the leather whip snapped apart at the base, the long tail of it spinning away into the dirt. The bullet buried itself in the hitching post 3 inches from Loretta's left wrist, sending a spray splinters across Knox's face. Knox stumbled back with a shout, one hand going to his cheek. Silence swallowed the square again. The stranger stood with his arms still extended, smoke rising from the barrel, eyes on Knox. He didn't look excited. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had done a necessary and unremarkable thing. Thorne set down his lemonade very carefully. "You are interfering," he said, "with the legal administration of Iron Ridge law." The stranger turned his head and looked at Thorne. Just looked at him for a moment. Knox had recovered. His face was bleeding in 2 small places where the splinters had caught him, and his eyes were ugly. He went for his sidearm. He never got there. The stranger moved with that same unsettling economy, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and what happened in the next 2 seconds was too fast for most to follow. Knox's gun hand was twisted. Knox's feet left the ground briefly. Knox hit the dirt of Iron Ridge Square on his back, hard enough to raise a cloud of red dust that drifted up around him, and settled slowly back down. He did not get up. The stranger holstered one revolver, left the other in his hand. He turned to face Thorne full on, and the two men regarded each other across the quiet square. Thorne did not flinch. Credit to him for that. His voice was controlled. "Do you have any idea who I am? I know exactly what you are." The stranger's voice was low and unhurried, with something in it like gravel dragged across stone. He cocked the hammer on the revolver. Then he cocked the second one, which he drew back out with his left hand, smooth and easy. 2 guns, both aimed. "Your law is filthier than a hog wallow, mister, and I don't follow a coward's law." Barnaby Thorne stared at him. The 60 people in the square stared at both of them, and for the first time all morning, not one of them looked at the ground. Ruthie Vance's diner sat at the far end of Main Street, past the livery and the dry goods store, and the little gap between buildings where stray dogs liked to sleep in the shade. It was a narrow building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Ruthie's Table in uneven blue letters. The windows were always clean. That was the first thing most people noticed. In a town as dusty as Iron Ridge, where everything accumulated a permanent coat of grime, Ruthie kept her windows so clean you could read your own face in them. Inside, it smelled like coffee and cornbread, and something faintly sweet underneath. Vanilla, maybe, or the cedar Ruthie used in her linen cabinet. 6 tables with mismatched chairs, a long counter with 4 stools, and a rule unspoken but understood by everyone in Iron Ridge that whatever happened outside that door stayed outside. Men who hated each other on the street had eaten at adjacent tables in Ruthie's without incident. Thorne's hired men had sat 2 chairs from the miners they'd beaten the previous week, and nobody had reached for a weapon. It was that kind of place. Ruthie had built it that way on purpose. Jed carried Loretta through the back entrance. She wasn't fully unconscious. She drifted in and out, aware of the movement, aware of the pain, aware of the stranger's coat rough against her cheek. She tried to tell him to put her down at least twice. He didn't acknowledge either attempt. Ruthie was already at the back door when they came through it. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with silver threaded through her black hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had handled every kind of emergency a small town could produce. She took one look at Loretta's back, said nothing, and pointed to the cot in the storeroom. She kept there for exactly these situations, which was its own kind of testament to what life in Iron Ridge had become. Jed laid Loretta down on her stomach. He straightened up. "I'll boil water," he said. "Pot's already on," Ruthie said. She was pulling cloth from a shelf, reaching for a brown bottle on the upper rack. "You can take yourself to the other side of that curtain now." He went without argument. He stood in the narrow kitchen while Ruthie worked. He could hear her speaking to Loretta in a low, steady voice, not quite words, more the sound of a voice designed to remind someone that they were not alone. He boiled more water without being asked and set it near the curtain for Ruthie to take when she wanted it. Then he stood against the far wall, with his arms crossed, and stared at a spot on the floor and waited. It took about 20 minutes. When Ruthie came out, she poured herself a cup of coffee and looked at him across the counter. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. She refilled her cup and said, "She'll be sore for a week. Nothing that won't heal if she doesn't tear it open, doing something foolish." A pause, which, knowing what I know about that woman, is not a guarantee. "She's awake?" "She is." He moved toward the curtain. Ruthie stepped slightly, to the side, not blocking him but watching him in that particular way she had, reading a person the way some people read weather. Loretta was lying on her stomach on the cot with a clean cloth across her back. She'd pulled herself up onto her elbows when she heard him come in. Her hair was loose and damp at the temples. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, and they fixed on him with an expression that moved from relief to recognition to something harder, all in about 3 seconds. She'd seen that face before. Not in person, on paper. A wanted poster tacked to the board outside the marshal's office. Reprinted so many times the ink had gone gray, and the corners had torn and been pinned back up. The face on the poster was younger. The artist had tried to make it look sinister, and had mostly succeeded. But the jaw was unmistakable, and the eyes, and the way the poster had described the set of his shoulders. Jedediah Jericho, wanted for murder and armed robbery. Known alias, the Shadow of Sweetwater. Reward, 2,000. She pushed herself up a little further. The cloth slipped. She grabbed it. Her jaw tightened. "You're Jericho," she said. "That's right." She held his gaze. He didn't look away, didn't make any move to deny or to explain. Just stood there in the storeroom doorway with his hat in one hand, waiting to see what she'd do with the information. "You're wanted in 3 territories. 4, he said. They added Colorado last spring." She stared at him, "And you walked into the middle of a public square. You asked for help." That landed somewhere uncomfortable. She looked away from him, at the wall, at the shelf of glass jars and folded cloth. She exhaled slowly through her nose. When she looked back, something in her face had shifted, gotten a little smaller, the hard front pulling back just enough to show what was underneath it. "I shouldn't have," she said quietly. Crying out like that. She pressed her lips together. In front of all those people. Jed was quiet for a moment. He looked at her, not with pity, not with the particular careful softness people sometimes used with wounded things. He looked at her straight. "Asking for help when you're being beaten isn't weakness, Loretta." His voice was flat and certain, like something he'd thought through a long time ago and arrived at the end of. "No man or law has the right to strip you of your dignity." He put his hat back on. "The cowardice belongs to those folks standing in the dirt watching it happen." She didn't respond, but she heard it. She heard it in a place she hadn't expected to feel anything from a stranger, and particularly not from this one. He turned toward the front of the diner. "I'll be gone before first light. You can get outside." He stopped, came up while Ruthie was working on me. I heard them through the wall. She nodded toward the front of the building. 4 men, maybe 5, sitting their horses out front. He moved to the kitchen window without hurrying and looked through the gap in the curtain. She was right. 5 men on horseback in the street, spread out in a loose half-circle facing the diner entrance. One of them was talking to another, gesturing toward the building. All of them were armed, and none of them were trying to be subtle about it. Ruthie came into the kitchen. She stood with her coffee cup and looked at Jed. "My kitchen," she said, "has never seen violence. I intend to keep it that way." "Yes, ma'am," Jed said. He stood at that window for another 10 seconds. Then he turned and went to the back of the building, moving through the storeroom and out the rear door, into the alley. Loretta heard him out there for a minute. Then nothing. Then a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a low creak, the shift of weight on a gate, and then hoofbeats. Not retreating hoofbeats. Fast, deliberate, building. She heard the men out front shout. One voice, then 2, then several, and then the unmistakable chaos of horses being startled by other horses, the hollow drumming of multiple sets of hooves on packed dirt, the bang of something wooden giving way, and voices raised in confusion and alarm. Ruthie walked to her front window and looked through the glass. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, very brief, suppressed quickly. "He stampeded Jim Hollis's team," she said. "Tied to the post outside the hardware store." She came back toward the storeroom. "Those boys out front have got their hands full of 6 very unhappy draft horses. We've got maybe 4 minutes." Loretta was already trying to sit up properly. She needed 3 attempts. She didn't ask for help. Ruthie handed her a clean shirt, without comment, something plain and dark that would do for the ride. Loretta got herself dressed in slow, careful movements, breathing through the parts that pulled at her back. By the time Jed came around to the alley side of the building, with 2 horses, she was standing on her own feet. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Can you ride?" he said. "Been riding since I was 4 years old." He handed her the reins of the nearer horse. They went. The ride out of Iron Ridge was done at a pace that was hard on Loretta's back, and she didn't say one word about it. They took the long way around, circling the north side of the ridge and coming down toward the valley through the scrub pine, where the shadows were long and the ground was soft enough to muffle the hoofbeat some. By the time the lights of Iron Ridge were small and distant behind them, she was operating purely on determination and the particular energy that comes from having no acceptable alternative to moving forward. Oakhaven Ranch appeared in the moonlight about 2 hours before dawn. It wasn't a grand place. Never had been. 3 buildings and a horse barn, a vegetable garden along the south fence, a windmill that needed new canvas on 2 of its fins. Elias had always meant to fix those fins. He'd mentioned it regularly enough that Loretta had stopped hearing the words. Now the windmill turned slowly in the night wind, lopsided and creaking, and the sound of it was the most familiar thing she'd heard all day. She dismounted before Jed could say anything and walked toward the front door. She stopped. The door was open, not blown open by wind, open in the deliberate way of a door that someone had walked through without concern for what the owner might think about it. The lock plate was broken, clean off the frame. Wood chips on the porch step. She looked back at Jed. He had already dismounted. He had 1 revolver. Out. He went in first. She followed. The inside of the cabin had been turned over with particular thoroughness. Drawers pulled out and dumped, shelves swept bare. The flour canister cracked open and emptied across the floor in a fine white drift. Her books were off the shelf, splayed on the ground, spines cracked. The tin box where she kept her correspondence had been pried open and emptied. She stood in the middle of it. Jed moved through the rooms. Quick, methodical, checking corners and the back door. When he came back to the main room, he stopped. He was looking at the kitchen table. Loretta turned and looked. Sitting in the center of the table was a horse's head, freshly severed. The blood had run off the edge of the table and was dripping steadily onto the floor in a slow, dark rhythm. Someone had driven a hunting knife through a folded piece of paper and into the wood of the table directly beneath it. Jed crossed to the table. He pulled the knife free and unfolded the paper without touching anything else. He read it, then he held it out to her. She took it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of penmanship a man practiced when he wanted his words to carry the same weight as a printed document. Leave by sunrise, or you'll be buried beside your husband. She read it twice, folded it, set it on the table beside the knife. She stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she straightened her shoulders, walked to the window, and looked out at her land in the moonlight. "I'm not leaving," she said. Jed looked at her back. He didn't say anything right away. He stood in that ruined kitchen with the blood dripping off the table and looked at this woman who had been flogged in a public square 8 hours ago and had ridden 2 hours through the dark with wounds that should have had her in a bed, and who was now standing at her own window like she was taking inventory of what still belonged to her. He put the hunting knife in his belt. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." He slept in the barn, what remained of it. There was a hayloft at the back that Thorne's men hadn't bothered with, and Jed climbed up there with his bedroll and his guns, and was asleep inside of 5 minutes. He slept light, the way he always did. Always had, even as a kid, before there was anything particular to be afraid of. It was just his nature. Half in, half out, one ear always running. He was awake before the sun broke over the ridge. Loretta was already up. He could see her through the gap in the barn wall, moving around the yard in the early gray light. She'd raked the worst of the debris off the porch. She was carrying water from the pump to the trough, 1 bucket at a time, moving with the deliberate care of a person whose back was objecting loudly to every motion, and who had decided not to listen. He climbed down from the loft and came out into the yard. She looked at him. He looked at her. That was the whole morning greeting. He watered and fed the horses while she went inside and made something on the stove. She put a plate of cornbread and a tin cup of black coffee on the table for him without asking what he wanted. He sat down and ate without commenting on it. She ate standing at the counter, looking at the window. The horse head was gone. He'd buried it before he went to the barn. "I'm going to fortify the place," he said. She looked at him. "Windows first. Then the front approach. You've got timber in the barn, enough for shutters on the 2 front windows that'll stop a rifle round if we make them thick enough. Your fence line on the south is a problem. Too open, they could come from that direction at night and be on the porch before you heard them." "Elias kept meaning to extend that fence," she said. "I'll extend it." She was quiet for a moment. "You're staying. Few days," he said. He finished the cornbread. "Just until you're standing solid." She turned back to the window. I know you don't need it," he said, cutting her off without raising his voice. "I'm not saying you do. I'm saying Thorne's not finished. And 2 people defending a position are better than 1. That's just arithmetic." She considered that. He could see her considering it. The small working of her jaw, the way she set her cup down and picked it up again. "All right," she said. They worked through the morning. He was good with his hands, which surprised her, and then didn't, once she thought about it. A man who'd survived years as a wanted outlaw in the territory had learned to fix things himself, because asking for help from other people was a liability. He built the shutters from rough-cut timber, heavy and braced, with iron pins that could drop them into brackets from inside in about 2 seconds. He fixed the south fence line with posts and wire from the lean-to behind the barn. She worked beside him. When he said, "Hold this," she held it. When he said, "Brace that," she braced it. She didn't make conversation, neither did he. The work got done. In the late afternoon, the heat came off the iron of the tools and the tar smell of the fresh-cut wood, and it settled over the ranch in a thick blanket that made everything slow and heavy. Jed came out of the barn carrying a shotgun. It was a 12-gauge, double-barrel, old but well-kept, the bluing worn off the barrel, but the action still clean. He'd found it on the rack inside the barn door, which was either something Loretta had forgotten was there, or something she'd avoided looking at. He set it on the fence post and looked at her across the yard. "Come here," he said. She crossed the yard, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked at the gun. "I know what a shotgun is," she said. "Do you know how to fire that one specifically?" She picked it up. The weight of it was substantial, and the grip was built for a larger hand than hers. She managed it, broke it open the way she'd seen Elias do, confirmed the chambers. She snapped it closed, raised it to her shoulder. Her form was wrong. Her elbow was too high, her cheek too far from the stock, her feet too close together. She looked down the barrel at the fence post she'd picked as a target, the one at the far end of the south line, maybe 40 feet out. She pulled the trigger. The recoil hit her like a physical argument. The stock came back against her shoulder with a force she hadn't prepared for, and the muzzle came up, and her feet scrambled for purchase in the dry dirt, and she went down. Not slowly, straight down onto her back in the yard, which hit her wounds from the lashes and knocked the breath clean out of her. She lay there for a second, staring up at the white-hot sky. Jed stood over her. He did not reach down. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He did not make any of the small, comforting sounds that people make at each other when something has gone wrong. He just stood there, looking at her with those creekwater eyes, and waited. She got herself up. It was not graceful. It was slow, and it involved one knee, and then the other, and then a lot of work from her arms, and at least one moment where she genuinely wasn't sure she was going to make it. But she got there. She was on her feet. Her shoulder was going to bruise badly, and her back had opinions about what she'd just put it through, and there was dust in her hair, and probably her mouth. She picked up the shotgun from the dirt where it had landed. Jed said, "A gun doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only knows who holds the grip steady." He looked at the gun in her hands. "If you want folks to respect your rights, you stand up on your own 2 feet and claim them." She looked at him. She could feel the bruise forming in real time across her shoulder. She cracked the gun, ejected the spent shell, loaded a fresh one from the box on the fence post. She closed it. She adjusted her feet. Wider this time. She brought the gun up to her shoulder, and this time she leaned into it, got her weight forward, over her front foot, got her cheek down against the stock. She aimed at the fence post. The second shot hit it square and cracked it 6 inches from the top. The recoil still moved her, but she didn't fall. She took it with her whole body, absorbed it, let it rock through her rather than fight it. She stood. She looked at the split fence post. Then she looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he gave one small nod, the most economical acknowledgement of something well done that she had ever witnessed. Again, he said. She loaded, raised, fired. The top of the fence post was gone. They kept at it until the lights started going orange and long. She went through a full box of shells and most of another. Her shoulder was going to be spectacular colors by morning. She didn't stop until he told her that was enough. Not because she needed permission, because she'd run out of fence posts to ruin. That evening they sat on the porch. Not close. She had the step, and he had the rail, and there was the length of an arm between them that neither of them moved too close. The sky went through its colors, the orange and the deep rose, and then the bruised purple that came just before full dark, and the windmill turned its slow, crooked circle against it all. You had a sister, she said. It wasn't quite a question. She'd heard things. Trail talk filtered through, even to isolated ranch women. She knew the rough shape of his story, the way you know the rough shape of a thing in poor light. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Clara, he said. She was 22. A man named Harlow Dent owned most of the land in Pima County. He wanted the small piece she'd inherited from our father. She wouldn't sell. He looked out at the darkening range. The law in Pima County worked for Harlow Dent. Loretta didn't say she was sorry. He didn't look like a man who needed that. What happened to Dent? She asked. He's dead, Jed said simply. She absorbed that, and the law's been after you since. Since I was 24 years old. He turned the empty coffee cup in his hands. I don't regret what I did to Dent. I've done other things since that I'm not as clear on. A man starts running, and the running becomes its own kind of life. She looked at him in the fading light. The wanted poster had made him look like a monster. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had been running for a long time and had gotten very tired. My husband Elias, she said. He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't as strong as the situation required. She looked at her own hands. Thorne came after us when he found out about the copper. I didn't know about the copper then. I just knew that Elias started staying up very late and not sleeping, and then he got quiet in the way that scared me. And then one morning he was just gone. She stopped. They said it was fever. You don't think it was fever. I think a lot of things Elias did in the last year of his life are going to make more sense. Once I get into those papers, Thorne's men didn't find. She looked at him because Thorne's men turned this whole place over, and they didn't find them, which means Elias hid them somewhere. Thorne didn't know to look. Jed looked at her. There was something in his expression, not pity, not even sympathy exactly. More like the recognition of someone in a situation he understood from the inside, where the enemy was large and the law was bought, and the only thing you had was yourself, and whatever you could figure out before they figured out, you'd figured it out. We'll find them, he said. She nodded once, leaned her back very carefully against the porch post, closed her eyes. The windmill turned. The stars came out over Oakhaven, thick and bright and indifferent, the way stars always are. Then Jed's head came up. She felt the change in him before she heard anything, that shift in stillness that meant something in the yard had changed. She opened her eyes. At the far end of the south fence line, near the barn, a light was moving. Small at first, flickering, and then it caught something it liked. The barn went up fast. Old dry wood and old dry hay will do that. One moment it was a flicker, and then it was a roar. The orange light flooding the yard, and the heat coming at them from 40 feet away like a physical force, and the horses inside began to scream. Loretta was off the porch before the thought had finished forming, and from somewhere in the tree line on the east ridge, a rifle cracked. The round went past Jed's ear close enough that he felt the air move. He dropped off the rail and hit the porch boards and had both revolvers out before he'd finished falling, rolling toward the shadow of the water trough. Another crack from the trees. The wood of the porch step exploded where Loretta had been standing 2 seconds ago. Thorne's men weren't waiting for sunrise. The barn was fully committed to burning within 2 minutes of the first flame catching. There was no saving the structure. Jed knew that from the moment he came off the porch. 30 years of dry timber and decades of compacted hay don't negotiate with water. They just burn. The only thing worth fighting for now was what was inside it. He went in through the side door. The smoke hit him first, thick and low, and he dropped into a crouch and moved along the interior wall, where the air was slightly cleaner. The horses were in the back stalls, all 4 of them, and they had gone past fear into that blind animal panic, where they were throwing themselves against the wood hard enough to crack it. He got the first stall open, and the mare inside didn't wait for encouragement. She hit him with her shoulder going past, and he went into the wall and tasted blood at the corner of his lip. He got back up and got the second stall. Loretta was already in the barn by then. She'd come in through the main doors from the other side, and she was coughing and moving low. And she got the 3rd horse free, while he got the 4th. They came out of the side door together, stumbling into the yard, horses thundering past them, and away into the dark, the heat at their backs enormous and immediate. From the east ridge, the rifle cracked again. The round hit the water trough, 3 feet to Jed's left, and sent a spray of water and splinters across his arm. He pulled Loretta down hard into the shadow of the trough, and they lay flat in the wet dirt, while the fire roared behind them, and the shooter up in those trees worked through his angles. "How many?" Loretta said. "1 rifle. Maybe 2. They're shooting down from elevation, which means their field of view is narrow. Stay low, and we move on my count." He watched the muzzle flash from the trees, timing it. 3. He counted. They moved. They made it to the cabin in a low scrambling run, through the door and flat against the interior wall, while rounds punched through the front window glass and hit the far wall in 2 places. Loretta was already at the rear window with the shotgun. She pushed the shutter open 6 inches and fired twice toward the tree line, not aiming, just making it uncomfortable up there, buying them a few seconds of the shooter keeping his head down. She reloaded. Jed was at the front shutter, now with his rifle, scanning the dark tree line in the intervals between muzzle flashes. He could see 2 positions now, not 1. Up high and to the left, a man with a repeater. Down lower and to the right, a man who fired less often and probably had a longer barrel. He took his time. Let the one on the upper left fire twice more, tracking the flash, calculating the distance. He fired once. The upper position went quiet. The lower position fired 2 more rounds in rapid succession, more panicked than aimed, then also went quiet. Not because Jed had hit anyone down there. Just because when the man next to you stops shooting, you tend to reassess your situation. Then nothing. Just the sound of the fire eating the barn and the distant hoofbeats of horses running themselves, calm somewhere on the dark range. They waited. Jed counted to 200 before he moved away from the window. Loretta waited on the other side and counted to her own number and came away from the rear shutter. They looked at each other in the orange-lit dark of the cabin. Fire glow coming through the broken front window and painting everything in moving amber and shadow. She had ash on her face and a cut above her left eyebrow from something she'd caught going through a doorway too fast. He had a bruise forming along his left arm from the mare and a split lip. "You hit anyone?" she said. "Don't know. Maybe." He moved to the front window and looked out. "They're gone for now." "For now," she said. She sat down on the kitchen chair, not because she wanted to, because her legs had finished their shift and were requesting relief. Pressed her palm over the cut above her eye until it slowed. Jed was moving through the room, checking the walls where the rounds had come in, making his own accounting of angles and trajectories. In that silent, automatic way, he did things. He came to the far wall near the fireplace and stopped. He looked at the floor. He looked at it for a moment too long for it to be nothing. Then he crouched down and pressed his palm flat against two of the floorboards. "Give me that fireplace poker," he said. She got up and brought it to him. He worked the flat end between two boards and applied pressure, and the boards came up more easily than old floorboards should, which meant they'd been designed to do exactly that. Underneath, packed into a space between the floor joists, was an iron box roughly the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oilcloth. Loretta stared at it. Jed lifted it out and set it on the kitchen table. The oilcloth was tied with a leather cord, and the cord had been tied by someone in a hurry. Knots. Overlapping knots. She worked at it while he held the box steady. When she pulled the cloth back, the iron box underneath was latched, but not locked. She opened it. Inside were papers, not debt papers. Not the loan documents Thorne had been waving around in the public square. These were something else entirely. She lifted the first sheet. It was a geological survey, carefully drawn, with measurements and markings she didn't immediately understand, but the title across the top was clear enough. Subsurface Mineral Survey, Oak Haven Property, completed September 1881. Surveyor, R.H. Caldwell. Finding, significant copper deposit, estimated depth 12 to 40 feet, eastern quadrant. She set it down, picked up the next sheet. It was a letter, written in a hand she recognized immediately. Elias's hand. She didn't read it all at once. She read the first 3 lines, and then set it down and breathed through her nose for a moment, and then picked it back up and finished it. When she was done, she put it back in the box with the survey paper and closed the lid. Jed was watching her. "Thorne knew about the copper," she said. Her voice was level. He approached Elias about a partnership. Elias turned him down. Then Thorne showed him fabricated debt papers and told Elias he owed money the ranch couldn't cover. Elias signed something he didn't understand and then realized what he'd done. She put her hand flat on the lid of the box. "The survey proves the loan is a fraud. It was never about debt. It was about getting Oak Haven because of what's underneath it." "That's enough to take to a legitimate court," Jed said. "If we can get to one that isn't in Thorne's pocket." He nodded slowly. "There's a federal circuit in Santa Fe. Montgomery doesn't have reach there." She looked at him across the table. The fire was down to embers outside now, the orange glow fading, the smoke smell coming in under the door. The box sat between them, with its freight of evidence and the ghost of a man she was still trying to understand. "There are letters in there between Elias and Thorne," she said. "A lot of letters, over almost 2 years. Did you know that they were in contact?" "No." She pressed her lips together. "Elias kept a lot from me. I think he was trying to protect me, and I think it went wrong somewhere. And I think by the time it went very wrong, there was no way back that he could see." She looked at the box again. "I'm not saying I forgive him. I don't know what I'm saying yet." Jed was quiet. He understood a lot about carrying the weight of something another person did, that you couldn't fix and couldn't undo. He didn't say so. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be shared. "Those papers stay hidden," he said, "not here. Somewhere off the property." "Ruthie." He looked at her. "Her kitchen," Loretta said. "No one goes in there hard, not even Thorne's men. It's the one place in Iron Ridge that operates by different rules, and everyone in this county knows it." She stood up. "I'll ride to her in the morning." "We'll ride," he said. She almost argued. Looked at his face. Didn't argue. She picked up the box and carried it to the bedroom shelf, tucked it behind the row of books that had been replaced on the shelf after she'd straightened the room the night before. Not hidden well enough for a thorough search, but enough for tonight. She came back to the doorway and stood there. "Elias built this ranch with me," she said. "Whatever he did or didn't do at the end, I built this place, board by board. I planted that garden. I dug that well. This land is mine." She looked at Jed. Nobody is taking it. He looked back at her. There was something between them in that moment that neither of them named. It had been building since the square, since the diner, since she'd picked herself up off the ground, after the shotgun put her there, since he'd sat on the porch rail and told her about Clara. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't easy, and it sat in the room between them like a third person, patient and quiet. "No," Jed said. "Nobody is." She went to bed. He went back to what remained of the barn. In the morning, the embers were cold, and the horses had drifted back to the fence line on their own, which horses sometimes do when the fear burns off and they remember where the hay is. Jed caught them and secured them to the fence. He was standing there with the iron box wrapped in fresh cloth and tucked under his arm when Loretta came out of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. He took it. They drank their coffee in the gray morning quiet, looking at the black ruin of the barn and the horses at the fence, and Oak Haven stretching away in every direction, still theirs, still standing. When they heard horses coming from the Iron Ridge Road, they both turned. The marshal came through the gate first. He was a narrow man named Gill, who wore his star crooked and his hat too far back, and had the look of someone who'd been given authority by a powerful man, and had never once questioned the arrangement. Behind him came 10 deputies, spread out in a loose line. Most of them Jed recognized as hired men. Thorne rotated through the county on a regular basis. The marshal held up a printed paper. Even from 30 feet, Jed could read the header. He'd seen that document plenty of times before, just never with this much money printed on it. 2,000 reward. "Jedediah Jericho," the marshal called out. "You are hereby under arrest for murder, armed robbery, and unlawful flight from justice." He turned his gaze to Loretta. The expression on his face was the one men wore when they'd been told to do something unpleasant but profitable. "Loretta Sterling, you are under arrest for harboring a fugitive and obstructing lawful authority." Loretta looked at the 10 deputies. She looked at Jed. He was already watching her. His hands were loose at his sides, waiting to see what she decided. She didn't step back. She didn't drop the coffee cup. She looked back at the marshal and said, "On whose warrant?" "The territory of New Mexico," the marshal said, acting under the authority of. "On whose specific instructions?" she said. "Today, this morning, with 10 men." The marshal stopped. Behind him, the deputies shifted on their horses. Loretta set her coffee cup on the fence post beside her. Very deliberately, like a woman who had all the time in the world and knew exactly where this was going. "You come to my burned-out ranch the morning after it was attacked by armed men," she said, "and you have 10 deputies and a wanted poster. You don't have any questions about who burned that barn last night." The marshal's jaw tightened. "Get them," he said to his men. The first deputy off his horse caught a face full of fence post splinters when Loretta's shotgun put a round into the top rail 2 feet from his head. She hadn't aimed to miss by much, and she hadn't. "Next one won't be the fence," she said. The deputy stopped. The men behind him stopped. The marshal was fumbling at his own holster and doing it slowly enough that it was obvious he was more comfortable behind a desk than in front of a gun. Jed had both Colts out. "Here's how this works," he said. He was looking at the deputies, not the marshal. He had a way of doing that, of finding the man in a group who was actually thinking and talking to him directly. "Your marshal is doing a rich man's business. Each one of you knows that. You can draw, and we can have this out right here. And some of you won't ride back to Iron Ridge this morning, and the ones that do will answer to a federal inquiry about why 10 armed men to burn this woman's property." A pause. "Or you put your guns on the ground and you ride out, and you tell Barnaby Thorne that Oak Haven isn't coming quiet." The man in the back of the group, a young one with a blond beard and a repeating rifle he hadn't raised yet, looked at the man beside him. That was the deciding moment. Jed had seen it happen enough times to know. There was always that look, that sideways consultation, and whichever way it broke, the group followed. The blond man put his rifle across his saddle and backed his horse 2 steps. 3 others did the same within a second. The marshal's face went through several colors. "You cowards," he said. "You yellow-bellied. Throw your gun over the fence line." "Marshal," Jed said, "or I will take it from you myself." The gun went over the fence. They didn't all leave. 3 of the deputies stayed, the marshal and 2 others who had more loyalty to Thorne's money than their own safety. A tense standoff developed around the front gate that went on long enough to be exhausting, and then resolved when Jed disarmed the remaining deputies in a series of quick movements that were difficult to counter because he didn't telegraph any of them. He didn't hit anyone harder than was necessary to get the gun away. He didn't draw blood. The marshal left on foot. His horse followed him out the gate on its own, eventually walking slowly, unimpressed by the whole situation. 7 of the deputies were gone inside of 10 minutes. The 2 who stayed had been left behind when they proved too slow in the retreat. One of them had a shoulder that was dislocated, Jed's doing, and sat against the fence post with his arm at an angle that made Loretta wince to look at. The other was Grizzly Knox. Knox had taken a shotgun pellet along his left ribs. Not a direct hit, probably spray from Loretta's second round, but enough to have put him down in the yard while his compatriots made their exit. He was sitting in the dirt with his back against the water trough, holding his side, and he was the least happy Jed had ever seen a man look, which was saying something, given the situations Jed had witnessed. Loretta stood over him. Knox looked up at her. He'd left his whip at home today, which was a small thing, but she noticed it. "You want to tell me who put you up to last night?" she said. Knox said nothing. "We can send for a doctor," she said. "Ruthie can dress that wound. A shotgun pellet in the ribs is manageable if it's cleaned properly, and it is very unmanageable if it isn't." Knox looked at her. Then he looked at Jed. Jed was reloading both Colts without looking down at his hands, watching Knox with the flat patience of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. Knox said, "If I talk, Thorne kills me. If you don't talk," Jed said, "you bleed out in the yard of the woman you whipped. And nobody comes looking for your body, because you're not the kind of man who gets looked for." Knox pressed his hand harder against his ribs. He stared at the ground for a long moment. "The loan's fabricated," he said. "All of it. Thorne had a man forge the documents 2 years back, after the mining survey came in. He does it every time. Runs a man into fake debt, pressures him until he signs something he doesn't understand, then calls the note when it suits him." He stopped, breathed. "It's not just this ranch. He's done it to 11 properties in this county in 6 years. Loretta crouched down in front of him. Her voice stayed even. "What about Elias? How did Elias die?" Knox looked away. "Out across the yard." "Knox," Jed said. Knox looked back at Loretta. Something in his face had changed. Not remorse exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered the chance to put it down. "Elias wasn't murdered," Knox said. "I want you to know I didn't touch him." He paused on that. "He came to Thorne about 6 months before the end. Said he wanted out of whatever deal he'd made, wanted to come clean, get the real papers to you. Thorne threatened to hurt you. Told Elias if he talked, it wouldn't be a lash in the square, it'd be worse." Knox's jaw moved. Elias was a gambling man, had been for years. He'd signed away more than just the loan documents. He'd signed over a portion of the mineral rights in a card game he thought he was winning, but Thorne had arranged. He was in deep. He knew it. He knew he'd put you in danger trying to get clear of it. Knox stopped again. He didn't die of fever. He chose to go. Left a note that Thorne collected before anyone else saw it. Silence. Loretta was very still. The morning light was coming in flat and gold across the yard, and it hit her face and showed everything she was working to keep controlled. Jed watched her and didn't speak. She stayed crouched in front of Knox for another 10 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to the cabin steps and sat down on them. Put her hands on her knees and looked at the burned ruin of the barn and the horses at the fence and the red dirt of the Oakhaven yard that she'd been walking her whole married life. Her husband hadn't been murdered. He'd been a gambling addict who'd signed away her home in a card game, been manipulated by a ruthless man into a corner he couldn't see out of, and then left her alone in that corner without a word of the truth. She sat with that. The grief was there, and the anger was beneath it. And beneath that, something worse, the slow rearrangement of every memory of the last 3 years. As she adjusted each one to fit this new shape of things, Jed came and sat on the step beside her. Not close, not touching, just present. Knox from across the yard had the decency to look at the ground. It was Loretta who moved first. She stood, straightened, looked at her hands, turned them over once, then put them at her sides. She looked at Jed. He looked back. Whatever she'd expected from this morning, it hadn't been this. But she was still here, and the land was still hers. And the box of papers was still on the shelf inside, and Thorne was still in Iron Ridge doing what he'd been doing for 6 years to 11 families in this county. That was still the thing. The whip crack of a rifle from the tree line shattered. The quiet, the round took Jed high in the chest. She heard it, a sound she never would be able to fully describe after. Not quite a crack and not quite a thud, but somewhere between the two, and then he was falling, backward and sideways, off the step and into the dirt of the yard, and the colts went with him and skidded away in the dust. She was beside him before she'd decided to move. He was on his back. His eyes were open. He was trying to say something, and producing nothing useful. The blood was coming fast, darkening his shirt front, and his left hand came up to it automatically, pressing in. Jed. She got her hands under his head. Jed, look at me. He looked at her. He was still there, still present, both eyes tracking. But the blood was serious, and the blur spreading across his face under the trail dirt was not a color she'd seen on a living person before. From the tree line, nothing further. The shooter was either satisfied or had moved position or was watching through a long glass to see the outcome. Knox, she called out. Her voice came out completely steady. She surprised herself with that. Knox had himself against the fence post, his own wound forgotten for the moment. Is there a back shooter still up there? She said. Knox stared at her. I don't know. I swear, I don't know. I didn't have a man in those trees. She looked at the tree line. Then she looked back at Jed. She got her arms under his shoulders. You're going to have to work with me on this, she told him. I can't carry you alone. Can you get your legs under you? He got his legs under him, barely, but enough. She got him through the cabin door and down onto the kitchen floor, because the floor was closer than the bed, and time was the issue now, not comfort. She cut his shirt open without looking for scissors, and assessed the wound with hands that did not shake, because she needed them not to. She had done this before. Not this specifically, but she had delivered calves and stitched horses and set her own broken finger with a piece of straight wood and cord. She was not a doctor, and she knew it. She also knew that the nearest actual doctor was in Iron Ridge and in Thorne's pocket, and would not be coming. She got the stove going. She got the water on. She got the tools she had, which were not the tools she would have chosen, but were the tools available, and she organized them on the table. The way Ruthie had organized things on that shelf in the storeroom, systematically, in the order she was going to need them. Jed had his eyes on her from the floor. His breathing was careful and deliberate, a man rationing each breath, making sure it counted. You scared? She asked him. Some, he admitted. Good, she said. It'll keep you awake. She knelt beside him. This is going to hurt considerably. I've been shot before, he said. Not by me, she said, and she got to work. The bullet was deep, but it hadn't hit the lung. She knew that, because he was still breathing with both sides of his chest, and because the blood, while serious, wasn't the particular bright dark red of a lung wound. She'd seen a man die of a lung shot once, 3 years back, a ranch hand of the Hollis family, who'd taken a round from a nervous hunter's misfired rifle. She'd watched it happen from 50 yards away, and she hadn't forgotten what it looked like. This was bad. Not that bad. She worked fast. The bullet had gone in below the left collarbone and angled downward, which meant it had stopped somewhere in the muscle mass of his upper chest, rather than traveling through to anything vital. She could feel the outline of it through the swelling, already forming around the entry wound, a hard shape about 2 inches below where the skin had closed over it. She got the fire in the stove, hot enough to sterilize the thin-bladed knife she kept for fine kitchen work. She got rags boiled and wrung out. She got Knox, who had dragged himself through the cabin door under his own power, propped against the far wall with a clean cloth pressed against his ribs and instructions to stay awake and stay quiet. She went back to Jed. He was watching the ceiling. His breathing was controlled and deliberate. "When I tell you to hold still," she said, "I mean completely still, even if it hurts." "All right," he said. "I'm going to need you to tell me if something changes, if you feel cold all over, or if things go narrow at the edges of your sight." "I know the signs," he said. "Done this before." "On yourself? Twice." She looked at him for 1 second. Then she got to work. The extraction took 11 minutes. She knew, because she watched the clock on the kitchen shelf, and she used the time to manage herself, breaking the task into intervals, refusing to think past the next 30 seconds at any point. He made sound twice, short, compressed sounds he tried to keep behind his teeth. He didn't move. She'd told him not to move, and he didn't, which required a degree of self-mastery that she noted and filed away for later. When the bullet came free, it was misshapen, having hit something on the way in that had slowed it and changed its angle slightly. She dropped it on the cloth beside her and closed the wound and tied it tight. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were red to the wrists. She looked at them for a moment. Then she got up and poured water over them from the basin and got them clean. Jed had his eyes closed. He was still breathing. She put her hand flat against his chest for 2 seconds and felt his heart steady if fast, and she exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. She got him off the floor and into the bedroom. This was a significant physical project. He was heavier than he looked, which was often true of lean men who were built in solid rather than large. He helped as much as he could, which wasn't much. She got him onto the bed on his back and got a clean cloth over the wound and got his boots off, which was the final indignity she put either of them through for a while. Then she went back to the kitchen. She sat at the table. The bullet was still on the cloth in front of her, small and misshapen and entirely unremarkable, for something that had almost ended the morning in a way she didn't want to think about. She pushed it aside and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. She was still sitting there. 20 minutes later, when Ruthie came through the back door. She hadn't sent for Ruthie, but Ruthie had a way of arriving where she was needed, which had more to do with a network of eyes and ears throughout the county than any supernatural gift, though people in Iron Ridge sometimes gave it that quality out of respect. Ruthie looked at the kitchen, the bloody rags, the surgical tools, the basin, Knox against the far wall. She looked at Loretta. She didn't say anything right away. She set down the bag she'd carried in, a canvas bag with medical supplies she'd brought from the diner. Things Loretta hadn't had. She checked Knox's ribs with efficient hands, cleaned and redressed the wound, told him the pellet had passed through, and he was going to be sore for 6 weeks, but was otherwise going to live, which Knox received without thanks. Then she came and sat across from Loretta. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot still on the stove, set one in front of Loretta, and wrapped both hands around her own. Loretta told her everything. Knox's confession, Elias, the gambling, the note Thorne had taken. She told it flat and straight, the same way she'd received it, without decoration. When she was done, Ruthie was quiet for a moment. She looked at Loretta across the table. "A weak man might have traded you away like cattle, Loretta," Ruthie said. Her voice was even and without apology. "But that outlaw out there took a bullet meant for you because he sees you as his equal." She set her coffee down. "Don't let a dead coward define who you are. Look at the strength in your own hands." Loretta looked down at her hands on the table, red at the knuckles still, scrubbed clean but stained at the creases. Hands that had kept a man alive this morning, Hands that had built fence and fired a shotgun and planted a garden and dug a well. She turned them over, looked at the palms. Ruthie was right. She knew Ruthie was right. It didn't make the grief less real, but grief and defeat were not the same thing, and she'd been conflating the two since Elias died, wrapping her loss in something passive that looked like mourning, but had started to function like surrender. She was not surrendering Oakhaven. She was not going to be defined by a man who'd been too afraid to tell her the truth. She was Loretta Sterling. She had built this ranch with her own hands. She had extracted a bullet from a wanted outlaw's chest on her kitchen floor this morning, and the man was alive and breathing in her bedroom because of what her hands knew how to do. She straightened in the chair. "I need to look at all those documents tonight," she said. "Every letter between Elias and Thorne. I need to understand the full picture before I decide how to move." "I brought what I could carry," Ruthie said. She nodded toward the canvas bag. "There's someone you should know about. A federal land assessor came through Santa Fe last month. He's been quietly looking into Thorne's property acquisitions. Nothing public yet, but he's been asking questions in the county records office." Loretta looked at her. "How do you know that?" Ruthie picked up her coffee. "People talk in diners, Loretta. They always have." Loretta looked at the bedroom doorway, at the dark quiet on the other side of it. She got up and went in. Jed was awake. She hadn't expected that. He was lying on his back, eyes open, looking at the ceiling in the way he had, of looking at things he was thinking through. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed. He turned his head and looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "How bad?" he said. "You'll live. You need to stay still for several days, which I expect will be the hardest part." A very faint indication of agreement crossed his face. She looked at him. She was tired, all the way down to the floor of herself, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix quickly. But under the tiredness was something else, something that had been growing since the feed store awning in Iron Ridge, since the diner, since he'd told her to stand up on her own 2 feet, and she had. "I have to tell you something," she said. "All right. I spent the last year believing I was waiting for justice to arrive from somewhere outside myself, waiting for someone to come along and make things right. And I kept waiting, and it kept not coming." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "And then the most wanted man in 4 territories came out of a shadow and shot a whip in half, and changed the entire calculation." She paused. "But that wasn't really it. The calculation changed when I got up off the ground after the shotgun knocked me flat, when I loaded and fired again, when I dragged you through that door this morning." Jed watched her. "I'm not grieving Elias anymore," she said. "I'm grieving who I thought he was, which is a different kind of loss, and I don't know yet exactly how to carry it. But I know that it doesn't get to own me." She met his eyes. "This land is mine. I am going to keep it, and I am going to dismantle everything Thorne has built in this county if it takes me the rest of my life." Jed was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. Then, quietly, "I've known that since the square." She held his gaze. He held hers. Between them, something real and unhurried passed without needing to be named. She reached over and put her hand on his, just rested it there. He turned his hand over and held hers. That was all. That was enough for now. She sat with him until he slept, then went back to the table, spread the documents out in the lamplight, and got to work. 3 days later, Thorne's bought newspapers hit the streets of Iron Ridge with Loretta's face on the front page. "Outlaw accomplice terrorizes county," the headline read. The story beneath it bore almost no relationship to actual events. There was no mention of the whipping, the arson, the armed assault on a private ranch. Instead, it described a volatile widow harboring a notorious killer and threatening local law enforcement. The bounty hunters arrived by the end of the week, 3 of them, riding in from different directions. Professionals who didn't drink in public or sleep where someone could find them easily. Oakhaven was about to face something worse than hired deputies. Jed was on his feet by the 4th day. Not steady feet, not fast feet, but vertical and moving under his own power, which he seemed to regard as sufficient. She'd argued with him about it on the morning of the third day and lost, which she'd expected. A man who'd been shot twice before and sewn himself up at least once was not going to stay horizontal because a woman told him to. Even a woman who'd extracted the bullet. She let it go. He knew his own body. What she'd noticed, watching him move through those slow recovery days, was that he thought constantly. He wasn't a man who lay still and rested his mind along with his body. He watched through windows. He asked questions about Thorne's operation, the mining camps, the layout of Iron Ridge, the names of families who'd lost property in the last 6 years. She answered all of it. He listened to every answer without interrupting, which was a quality she'd come to value more than she expected to. On the 5th morning, he said, "We can't fight this with guns." She looked up from the documents spread across the table. "We've been fighting it with guns," he said. "And we've been losing slowly in the way that people lose when the other side has more guns and more money. We take out his men, he hires more. We hold the ranch, he holds the court and the newspaper and the circuit judge." He sat down across from her. "We have to change the field." "The mining camps," she said. He looked at her. She'd been thinking the same thing. "I've been reading these letters all week," she said. Elias wrote about the camps, the conditions, the men working 12-hour shifts in those tunnels for wages that don't cover their rent because Thorne owns the company housing. They pay him to live there. They work for him to pay the rent. Nobody gets ahead, and nobody leaves because they can't afford the stage fare out. She set the letter down. There are families in those camps. Women, children, veterans who came west after the war looking for something and found another man telling them what they were worth. How many people in those camps? 3 camps total. Ruthie thinks close to 300 people between them, plus the independent homesteaders Thorne has been squeezing on the east side of the county. She looked at him. People who've been waiting for someone to tell them that what's happening to them is actually happening, that they're not alone in it. He nodded slowly. "Thorne keeps them divided," he said. "The miners don't talk to the homesteaders. The women aren't in any of those conversations. The veterans feel separate from the civilians. He keeps them that way on purpose, because 11 families losing property quietly is easy to manage. 300 people moving together is not." She understood exactly what he was saying. 2 days later, they rode to the camps. Ruthie came with them. She knew people in the camps in a way that Loretta and Jed did not, had been supplying the camp families with extra food for 2 years through a quiet arrangement that Thorne's management didn't know about, which spoke both to Ruthie's organizational capacity and to the blindness of men who don't pay attention to how communities actually function. They went to the first camp at dusk, when the shift was changing, and men were coming up from the shafts with that particular blankness that comes from 10 hours underground. The camp was a collection of low structures along a muddy creek. The company housing Thorne charged rent on, each unit holding more people than it was built for. Word moved fast that there were outsiders. By the time Loretta stood in the open area between the buildings, there were close to 80 people gathered. Men in work clothes still dirty from the shaft. Women with children on their hips or pulling at their skirts. A cluster of older men who'd served in the war and stood a little apart with the watchful habit of people who'd learned not to trust a gathering until they knew who'd called it. Loretta looked out at them. She'd never spoken to a crowd before. She'd spoken to Jed and to Ruthie and to Elias and to the 4 walls of Oakhaven. She felt the weight of all those faces, and for a moment she understood why Elias had made the choices he'd made. Fear was very loud when the room was quiet. She didn't let the moment run long. "My name is Loretta Sterling," she said. "I own Oakhaven Ranch, east of Iron Ridge. Or I did until Barnaby Thorne decided the copper under my land was more valuable than my right to live on it." She let that sit for a second. "He sent men to burn my barn. He had me flogged in the public square. He put a story in his newspaper calling me an outlaw. And 3 days ago, one of his snipers put a bullet in my friend. She looked at the faces, some of them hard with distrust, some of them raw. I know what you're going to say, because it's what I said for a year. You're going to say that you can't afford to make an enemy of Thorn, that you need the work and the housing, and you can't fight a man with that much money and that many guns. She stepped forward slightly. I'm not here to tell you that's wrong. That's been true up to now. Then why are you here? A man near the front said. Because I found his papers, she said. I found the fraudulent loan documents, the forged surveys, the correspondence where he discusses which properties to target and how to manufacture the debt to force people out. 11 families in 6 years. I can name every one of them, and I have the paper to prove every transaction was a fraud. She looked at the man who'd spoken. Thorn feeds on our fear. He divides us by class, by race, and by gender. But when we bleed in those mines or on those streets, every drop is the same color. Her voice went up slightly, not in volume, but in certainty. If we stay quiet, today, tomorrow it'll be your daughters lashed to that wooden post. The crowd was silent, not the silence of indifference, the silence of people who have been holding something in for a long time and have just heard it said out loud by someone else. A woman in the middle of the group, holding a small boy on her hip, said, "What do you need from us?" "Numbers," Loretta said. "When we take this to court, I need people willing to stand in that square and say what's been done to them. Thorn can buy a judge, but he can't buy a federal inquiry. And he cannot buy the sight of 300 people standing in Iron Ridge and calling him a liar to his face." The war veteran, who'd been standing apart from the group, came forward. He was maybe 50, gray in his beard and hard through the eyes. "What's to say Thorn doesn't just have the lot of us arrested?" "He might," Loretta said. "I'm not going to tell you there's no risk. I'm telling you the risk of staying quiet is worse. It's just slower." She looked at him directly. "I've been taking his punishments quietly for a year. It didn't make him stop. It made him think he could do more." Jed had said nothing through all of this. He stood to the side, visible but not the center of it, which was right. This wasn't his fight to claim. He was here because of what he believed, not because he was leading it. The veteran looked at him, then back at Loretta. "When?" he said. "We need 10 days, she said. "Maybe less. We have to reach the other 2 camps and the homesteaders on the east side. When we move together." They went to the 2nd camp the next evening, and the 3rd the day after that. By the end of the week, word had moved along the county's invisible networks, the ones that ran through Ruthie's diner, and the informal gatherings in the camp housing, and the connections between homesteading families that Thorn's men had never bothered to map because they'd never considered these people a serious threat. They were wrong about that. Riding back from the 3rd camp, late on the 7th night, Jed and Loretta moved through the dark in silence for a while. The stars were thick overhead, and the land rolled away on both sides, quiet and enormous. "You know what you did back there?" he said. She looked over at him. "You didn't ask those people to follow you," he said. "You told them the truth and let them decide. That's rarer than you'd think." She rode for a moment before answering. "Ruthie did it first. In that diner she built. She made a place where everyone was the same weight, and she did it every day, quietly, without asking for anything back. I just said out loud what she's been demonstrating for years." He looked at her. She looked ahead at the dark range. Then a rider came at them fast from the Iron Ridge Road, pulling up hard with dust rising around the horse's legs. It was a young man from the 1st camp. He was breathing hard, and his horse was lathered. "They've called a court session," he said. "Judge Montgomery, tomorrow morning, in the square. Thorn's putting Oakhaven through the court, and he's got papers to do it." He looked at Loretta. "He's declaring the property legally, his by default." Loretta was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "All right," she said. She looked at Jed. "Ride to the camps tonight," she told the young man. "Tell everyone, tomorrow morning, Iron Ridge Square." The young man turned his horse and went. Loretta looked at Jed. He looked back. "I have to do this part alone," she said. He started to speak. Not the whole thing, she said. Just the first part. I need to walk into that square by myself. I need them to see me walk in by myself. She held his gaze. You'll know when to come. He looked at her for a long moment. Trust was not something that came naturally to him, not after 12 years of running. But he looked at this woman in the dark, on the road back to her ranch, and he found that he trusted her completely. I'll know when to come, he said. She turned her horse toward Oakhaven. Iron Ridge was quiet when Loretta rode in. Too quiet for a morning, with a court session called. Usually, when Montgomery ran his outdoor proceedings, the square filled early with people looking for entertainment or needing to be seen attending. Today, the boardwalks held only a few figures, and they stood back in the shade, watching her come down Main Street alone on a bay horse with a satchel across her lap. She felt every eye. She rode to the square, dismounted, tied the horse at the rail, and walked in. Thorne was already there. He stood near a table that had been set up facing the makeshift judge's bench, a heavy chair dragged out from the courthouse with Montgomery's seal on a board behind it. Thorne had 3 lawyers with him, men brought in from somewhere with money enough to dress well even in the territory heat. He had 6 armed men flanking the perimeter of the square. He also had the newspaper editor standing off to the side with a notepad, ready to record whatever version of events Thorne needed printed. When Thorne saw Loretta come in alone, he smiled. Not at her, at his lawyers. The small, satisfied smile of a man watching a conclusion arrive on schedule. Montgomery came out from the courthouse at 9 o'clock exactly. He was a narrow man, with a gray mustache he kept too long for his face, and the careful movements of someone who had learned to read a room before committing to any position in it. He settled into his chair, arranged his papers, and looked over the square. His eyes landed on Loretta, standing alone on her side of the proceedings. Then he looked at Thorne's table, at the lawyers, at the 6 armed men. He cleared his throat. This session is called to determine the lawful ownership of the property known as Oakhaven Ranch, comprising 412 acres in the eastern portion of this county. He said, Mr. Thorne, you may present. Thorne's lead lawyer stood and laid out the case, with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this in other courtrooms, in other towns with other judges who owed other powerful men favors. He presented the loan documents. He presented the default notice. He presented a sworn statement from the marshal attesting to Loretta's failure to vacate. He presented it all in a clean, confident line from beginning to conclusion, and when he sat down, Oakhaven looked lost on paper. Montgomery looked at Loretta, Mrs. Sterling. He said, You may respond. She walked to the center of the square. She opened the satchel. Your Honor, she said, I present a geological survey of Oakhaven Ranch, completed in September of 1881 by licensed surveyor R.H. Caldwell, commissioned by Barnaby Thorne himself, which identifies a significant copper deposit beneath the property's eastern quadrant. She placed it on the table in front of Montgomery. I present correspondence between Thorne and my late husband, Elias Sterling, spanning 18 months, in which Thorne acknowledges the existence of the survey, proposes a partnership, and upon refusal, discusses manufacturing a debt instrument to compel the property transfer. She placed the letters. I present county tax records showing Oakhaven has been current on its obligations for 11 consecutive years, with no recorded loan held by Iron Ridge Savings and Trust prior to the document Thorne's counsel just presented. She placed the tax records. And I present bank ledgers obtained through Ruthie Vance, showing that the loan account number cited in Thorne's documents does not correspond to any actual account in this county's financial records. She stepped back. The loan is a fraud, she said. The debt is fabricated, and the pattern it follows matches 11 other property transfers in this county over 6 years, all of which I can document if the court requires it. The square was very still. Montgomery looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. His hands were flat on the table, and his face had gone through several careful arrangements before settling into something unreadable. Thorne's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, these documents are themselves unverified. They carry official seals, Loretta said. The surveyor's seal, the county recorder's seal, and the seal of the Territorial Bank Examiner's Office. You're welcome to verify them. From the perimeter of the square, one of Thorne's armed men shifted his position. The sound that came from the north end of Main Street was not loud at first, just a gathering rumble, the low, unified movement of many feet on packed earth. Then it grew and kept growing. They came from the north end and the south end and the alley mouths and the side streets. Miners still in their work clothes, homesteading families with their children. Women who had never in their lives walked into Iron Ridge's public square with any intention of being seen. The war veteran from the first camp walked at the front of the North group, moving at an even unhurried pace. And behind him came people three abreast, filling the street as far back as the eye could reach. They surrounded the square in silence. Not threatening silence, witness silence. The silence of people who had come to watch the law do its job and intended to make sure it did. Montgomery looked up from the documents. He looked at the people surrounding the square. He looked at Thorne. Thorne's expression had changed. The comfortable satisfaction was gone. He was doing a rapid calculation behind his eyes, weighing the documents on the table against the crowd in the street, weighing his lawyers against the federal implications of what those documents contained. Montgomery straightened in his chair. I find the evidence presented by Mrs. Sterling to be substantial and credible, he said. His voice was careful. I find further that the loan documents submitted by the plaintiff contain irregularities that require federal examination. Pending that examination, the property transfer is suspended. Oakhaven Ranch remains in the possession of Loretta Ann Sterling. Thorne's chair scraped back. That is not acceptable, he said. His voice had lost its courtroom smoothness. Something raw had come through. Montgomery, we had an arrangement, Mr. Thorne, Montgomery said, and his voice hardened in a way that surprised even the people who knew him. I would strongly suggest you stop speaking. Thorne looked at the documents, at the crowd, at his lawyers, who were already exchanging glances with each other in the way of men who are beginning to think about their own exposure. He snapped. He turned to his 6 armed men, and he said, "Take the judge. Shoot anyone who gets in the way." The armed men moved. The crowd moved with them. What happened in the next 60 seconds was not a clean or organized thing. It was smoke and shouting and the crash of the lawyer's table going over and people from the camps pushing back against Thorne's men with the accumulated energy of people who have been absorbing punishment for years and have finally decided that absorbing it is worse than stopping it. Tooths were fired, both by Thorne's men, both into the air, because when you're surrounded by 200 people, the calculus of firing changes considerably. From somewhere in the press of bodies, Montgomery went down behind his heavy chair, which he pulled over himself like a shield, which was undignified but effective. And then, down the length of Main Street, came the sound that cut through every other sound in that square. Hoofbeats, fast and certain and building. Jed Jericho came through the north entrance of the square at a full gallop, and he was not alone. Behind him rode 20 armed miners on horses they'd borrowed or owned, coming down Main Street in a column that parted the chaos the way a stone parts water. He pulled up in the center of the square, the horse turning under him, and he looked at Thorne's 6 men with both revolvers already in his hands. "Put them down," he said. Every weapon in Thorne's employ hit the ground inside of 5 seconds. The battle for Iron Ridge lasted less than an hour. It didn't look like a battle at its end. It looked like an accounting. Thorne's hired men, stripped of the advantage that comes from operating in the dark against people who don't know they're coming, were simply outnumbered and outmaneuvered in daylight by people who had nothing left to lose. Jed moved through the square with the miners fanning out behind him, And where Thorne's men held positions, they were flanked. And where they made threats, they were met by a wall of people who had decided that the threat of harm was no longer sufficient reason to stand aside. Loretta fought alongside him. She was not in the background. She was not waiting at the edges. She moved through the square with the shotgun across her arm, and when two of Thorne's hired bounty hunters tried to circle around from the alley side to get behind the miners, she cut them off at the corner of the dry goods store and put a round into the dirt at their feet that lifted a spray of dust across both of their boots. They stopped. Guns on the ground, she said. They looked at her, at the shotgun, at the 200 people filling the square behind her. The guns went on the ground grisly. Knox came from the back of the square. He'd been watching the proceedings from the south entrance, hanging at the edge of it, and when the chaos broke out, he must have made a decision because he came forward with a revolver in his hand and his eyes on Jed's back. He moved fast for a man with a pellet wound still healing in his ribs. Loretta saw him. She raised the shotgun and fired. Knox went down hard, not dead. The round caught him in the shoulder and spun him and put him into the dirt, and he stayed there with the revolver skidding away across the packed earth of the square. He looked up at her from the ground. She looked back at him. She thought about the hitching post. She thought about the whip. She thought about standing in that square with her hands tied and 60 people watching and not one of them moving. "Stay down," she said. He stayed down. The square was clearing. Thorne's men were disarmed, most of them sitting in the dirt under the watch of miners with their own guns trained. Montgomery had emerged from behind his chair and was standing against the courthouse wall with the careful expression of a man reassessing every decision he'd made in the last 3 years. Thorne was gone. She saw it before anyone said it. His spot at the ruin table was empty. His lawyers were still there, but Thorne was gone, and the door to the bank building at the corner of the square was swinging on its hinges. She looked at Jed. He was already moving. She followed him. The bank was dim inside after the hard morning sun. Thorne was at the back, behind the main counter, and he had his iron safe open and was pulling documents out of it in fistfuls, stuffing them into a leather satchel, with the particular focus of a man who had already written off everything, except what he could carry. He heard them come in. He turned with the satchel against his chest, and he looked at Jed across the bank floor, and his face did a complicated thing. The polish and the power were gone. What was left underneath was smaller than the man who'd sipped lemonade in the square while a woman was flogged. Jed crossed the floor, stopped 10 feet from him. Thorne looked at the revolvers on Jed's hips. They were still holstered. That seemed to confuse him. "Go on then," Thorne said. His voice had a ragged edge now. "Shoot me. You're an outlaw. That's how your kind settles things." Jed looked at him for a long moment. He reached down and drew his right revolver. Thorne flinched back against the safe. Jed lowered it. He held it. At his side, not aimed, not holstered, just held. "I used to think a bullet was the only way to get justice," he said. His voice was quiet and without heat. "But killing you just makes me another monster like you." He met Thorne's eyes and held them. "Real justice is letting you live in a cell, watching the very women and working folks you trampled over rebuild this territory under the law." Thorne stared at him. His mouth opened, closed. Loretta came forward and took the satchel from his unresisting hands. She looked inside. Deeds, correspondence, financial records. Everything he'd been trying to take with him was exactly the evidence they needed. She looked up at Thorne. "Thank you," she said. 2 miners from the square came through the bank door. Between them, they had a length of rope and the expression of people who had waited a long time for this particular morning. Thorne went in chains. They brought him out into the sunlight of Iron Ridge Square, and the people who were standing there watched it happen, and nobody in that crowd looked at the ground. Jed walked out of the bank into the light. He stopped on the steps. He stood there for a moment in the sun, and something in his posture shifted Some long-held tension that had been running in him for 12 years, the posture of a man perpetually about to run, and it eased out of him slowly, like a breath finally let go. Then a voice cut across the square. Jericho. Montgomery had found somewhere to be useful. He was standing 10 feet away with a pistol drawn and a wanted poster. In his other hand, the paper gray and worn from being reprinted so many times. He held it up. He looked at Jed across the cleared ground of the square. "The law owes you a debt," Montgomery said. His voice was tight, but a murder warrant is still a murder warrant. A pause. "You're under arrest." Jed looked at the pistol, looked at the judge. He didn't reach for his guns. Nobody moved for a long moment. The square held its breath, the miners with their guns, the homesteading families, the women from the camps, the people who had lived in Iron Ridge for years and watched from behind glass every time Thorne's machinery ground someone down. They all stood there in the morning sun and looked at the judge and the outlaw and waited. Then they stepped forward. Not one person. Many, in ones and twos, moving into the space between Montgomery and Jed, until there were 40 people standing in that gap, quiet and deliberate and entirely immovable. The war veteran from the first mining camp was among them. So was the woman with the small boy who had asked, "What do you need from us?" So was the young man who had ridden hard through the dark to bring news of the court session. So was Ruthie Vance, who had left her diner unlocked and walked down Main Street in her apron, and was now standing with her arms at her sides in the center of Iron Ridge Square, looking at Judge Montgomery with the particular authority of a woman who had been quietly running the moral center of this town for 15 years. Montgomery looked at all of them. He looked at his pistol. He looked at Jed. Loretta stepped forward from the bank steps. She was carrying the satchel in one hand and a folded document in the other. She crossed the square and stopped in front of Montgomery and held the document out. "Petition for executive pardon," she said, "signed by every resident of Iron Ridge and the surrounding county who had a hand to sign with, along with a formal statement from Grizzly Knox, who has agreed to give full testimony attesting that Jedediah Jericho's original act in Pima County 12 years ago was committed in defense of his sister against an armed man who had already committed violence and was in the act of committing more." She held it steady. "It's self-defense on the record, Your Honor. It's always been self-defense." Montgomery looked at the petition. He looked at the crowd. He was a man in the middle of recalculating everything, and she could see him doing it, weighing what had been against what was possible, weighing what Thorne had bought him, against what it had cost him to be bought. He holstered the pistol. He took the petition. He read it, not quickly. He stood in the square and read it properly, every page, while 200 people waited. When he finished, he folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. Then he held up the wanted poster. He looked at it for a moment, at the gray ink and the worn edges, and Jed's face rendered sinister by a man who'd never met him. He tore it in half. The square exhaled. Someone in the crowd made a sound, then more sounds. Then the veteran near the front put his hat in the air and said something too quiet to hear over the noise that came after it, the full-throated release of 200 people who had been holding a very long breath. Loretta turned and found Jed behind her. He was looking at the torn pieces of paper in Montgomery's hands, with the expression of a man who has been braced for a particular outcome for so long that the absence of it takes a moment to become real. She walked to him. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. He nodded once. "It's done. The whipping post came down that afternoon. It took 8 men about 20 minutes. The crowd watched it happen in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of the square. 2 weeks ago, when 60 people had stared at their feet while the lash came down, this was the silence of people choosing to witness something, committing it to memory, making sure they would be able to say they had been there when it fell. When it hit the ground, someone brought a torch. The dry wood caught fast. It burned, bright and short. The way things burn when they've been standing in the sun for years and are ready to go. People watched it until there was nothing left but ash and a dark stain in the dirt of the square. In the weeks that followed, Iron Ridge changed in ways that were slow and practical and real. Thorne was transported to Santa Fe under federal escort, his files cataloged by the land examiner's office, his fraudulent deeds unwound one by one. The 11 displaced families received documentation restoring their claims. The mining camp wages were reviewed under a newly appointed county commission that included, for the first time, people who had actually worked in those mines. Ruthie Vance was appointed to the town's inaugural council at the first proper meeting held in Iron Ridge's new public hall, which was the old bank building with the vault removed and the windows replaced and 6 mismatched tables pushed together in the center for anyone who wanted to sit. Oakhaven became something Loretta had imagined on the worst nights of the past year, when imagining things was the only thing she had. A cooperative ranch. The laborers who worked the land held shares in it, fair wages, and documented agreements. The kind of arrangement that treated a person's labor as something with genuine worth. The garden along the south fence expanded. The windmill got its canvas fixed. New construction went up on the north side where the barn had burned, built better and stronger than what had been there before. She did most of the planning at the kitchen table. Same table where the iron box had sat in lamplight. Same table where she'd laid out surgical tools on a bad morning. It was a good table. She kept it. On a morning in early October, when the heat had finally broken, and the light came in gold and flat across the range, she was standing at the fence looking out at the land when she heard him come up behind her. He stopped at the fence beside her. He'd stayed. That was still a thing she was getting used to, the ongoing daily fact of it. A man who'd spent 12 years moving and had stopped moving. He'd built the new fence posts along the south line himself, working slowly while the chest wound finished healing, working steadily. He was not a man who needed to be told what needed doing. He just looked at what was in front of him and did it. She looked out at Oakhaven in the October light. I spent a lifetime believing the West belonged to the men with the fastest guns and the coldest hearts, he said. His voice was quiet, not performing anything, just saying the true thing. You proved to me that compassion and respect are the only things strong enough to truly tame it. She looked at him. He was watching the range, the long open miles of it, the scrub and the red earth and the sky going high and clear above all of it. She turned back to the view. We don't tame a wild land with guns, Jed, she said. We tame it with love and equality. He turned his head and looked at her. She looked back at him. He reached over and took her hand, where it rested on the top rail of the fence. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, his arm coming around her, and they stood there together against the new fence line of Oakhaven Ranch in the October morning light. He pressed his lips to her hair. She closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, and the solid warmth of him beside her and the ground of her own land under her feet, ground she had fought for and kept, ground that now belonged to more people than just herself, which was exactly what she'd wanted for it. The windmill turned. The range stretched away to the horizon, wide and open and full of the particular promise the West had always made to people willing to build something real in it. The dark days were behind them. What was ahead was theirs to make. Loretta Sterling didn't win because she was lucky. She didn't win because a dangerous man showed up with fast hands and faster guns. She won because when the whip came down and the world turned its back, she made a choice that most people never find the courage to make. She decided that her life, her land, and her dignity were worth fighting for, even when every single person around her had already decided they weren't. That's the heart of this story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. We live in a world that tells us to be quiet when powerful people do wrong things. It tells us the system is too big, the money is too deep, the names are too connected. It tells us that speaking up will cost more than staying silent. And sometimes, honestly, that's true. Loretta knew it was true. She'd been paying that cost for a year before we ever meet her. But silence didn't protect her. It just made Thorne bolder. It made Knox swing the whip harder. It made 60 people standing in that square believe that what was happening was acceptable, because nobody said out loud that it wasn't. The moment she cried out, that single, broken, desperate cry for help was not her weakest moment. It was the crack in the wall that let the light in, because Jed Jericho heard it. And Jed, a man who had every reason to keep his head down and ride on, chose not to. Not because it was safe, not because it was smart, because there are things a person with a genuine moral code simply cannot walk past. That's the second lesson this story carries. Jed is wanted in 4 territories. He's done things he isn't proud of. He is, by every legal measure, a criminal. And yet he is the only person in Iron Ridge that morning who acts like a human being. This story isn't asking you to romanticize outlaws. It's asking you to think about what the law actually protects and who it actually serves, and what a person of genuine conscience does when those 2 things stop lining up. The third thing, and this might be the most important one, is what happens at the mining camps. Loretta doesn't just fight for Oakhaven. She rides out to people she's never met and tells them the truth. She doesn't ask them to follow her. She doesn't promise them safety. She tells them what Thorne has done, shows them the evidence, and lets them decide. And they decide to stand up. 300 people from different backgrounds, different races, different circumstances, miners, homesteaders, veterans, women who'd never been invited into a public square, before they stand together. And they change everything. Not because one hero saved them, because they saved each other. Ruthie Vance built that possibility long before Loretta ever rode into those camps. She built it one clean window at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one meal served to enemies, sitting at adjacent tables without incident. She created a place where everyone was the same weight. She never fired a gun. She never gave a speech. And she ended up on the town council because the community she'd quietly built for 15 years was the foundation everything else stood on. Never underestimate the person who shows up every day and simply treats people with dignity. That work compounds. It changes the shape of a place over time, in ways that are invisible until suddenly they're not. And then there's Jed's choice at the end. Thorne on his knees, the safe broken open, the man who burned the barn and bought the judge and ordered the lashes completely at Jed's mercy. Everything in Jed's history, everything in his blood, every year of running and grief and rage pointed at that moment like an arrow. And he lowered the gun. Not because he forgave Thorne, not because he was soft, because he understood something that took him 12 years of violence to learn that becoming the thing you hate is still becoming it, regardless of your reasons. Real justice isn't the fastest bullet, it's the longest consequence. It's Thorne in a federal cell, watching the people he ground down rebuild everything he destroyed. That's not mercy. That's something harder and more permanent than a bullet ever could be. So what does this story give you? It gives you Loretta, who teaches you that your dignity is not negotiable, and your grief is the same thing as your defeat. It gives you Jed, who teaches you that a moral code lived under pressure is the only kind that actually counts. It gives you Ruthie, who teaches you that the quiet daily work of building something fair is never wasted. It gives you those 300 people in the square who teach you that the most powerful thing in the world is ordinary people who stop being afraid at the same time. And it gives you that last image. 2 people standing at a fence line on an October morning, looking out at land that almost wasn't theirs anymore. One of them spent 12 years running. The other spent a year being ground down. And they're both still standing, together, on ground they earned. That's what the West was always supposed to be. Not the fastest gun, not the richest man, A place where people willing to build something real could build it and keep it. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, locations, events, and organizations depicted are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The historical setting and period details are used as a narrative backdrop and are not intended as a comprehensive or academic representation of life in the American West. The themes explored, including violence, systemic injustice, and personal loss, are handled with the intent of illuminating human resilience and the pursuit of dignity, not to glorify harmful behavior. Viewer discretion is advised for sensitive content.